بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So we move on to, I believe this is lesson 9. So yes, the previous lesson was quite complicated and it did drag on quite a bit, and there's a lot of content, a lot of detail covered. Some of the topics were quite abstract as well within that. So and yeah, that is just how usul is, unfortunately. I do apologize myself for dragging in a few places. I do have a tendency to over explain, especially because I can't see who I'm teaching and I don't get any feedback in terms of, what's understood and what's not. So I tend to over explain rather than under explain. um I mean, having listened to myself back some of these recordings, maybe I listen to myself on times too, and I think that that is probably about the right speed, because I think I talk quite slow sometimes. So maybe that's something that you can look into. Probably a lot of you are already doing that. But yeah, so yesterday, yeah, so it's just the way usul works is you generally get thrown into the deep end of these concepts that you never really understood before properly, and or never really thought about in that way before, because it's a completely new subject, and it's very abstract as well. You don't really conceptualize things in this way in other subjects. And then you're slowly going through the categories, and you kind of began to get the hang of what you're dealing with, and then suddenly then you come across a subject like commands, where there's so much detail and so much specifics, and some it's like it's a lot of depth now you're covering, compared to you're looking at general categories before. Now you're looking at something in a lot of detail. It kind of catches you off guard again, and then you've got to kind of again, okay, what are we dealing with, and slowly get the hang of that again. That's just, as I said at the beginning of the course, it's the nature of usul. It's the nature of this subject. So anyway, today we're going to be looking at detail, haqiqa and majaz. So we're going to be looking at the literal and the metaphorical in a lot of detail. We're going to go into quite a lot of depth, because if you recall, all we did when we went over it was we said that words can be used literally, words can be used metaphorically, and we didn't really go into much more detail. So here there's a lot more detail in terms of different types of metaphorical, why you'd use a metaphorical instead of the literal, and there's quite a lot of depth that we're going to be going through in this lesson, and then in the next lesson we'll try and finish it off as well. And again, there's quite a few abstract concepts here and a bit of depth, so I'm just warning you of that. Again, I'll try and make it clear, hopefully a lot more concise than the previous lesson, rather than going on, and hopefully it's not as, I think it's a bit more intuitive than the previous lesson, to be honest. So if you found the previous lesson easy, then this should hopefully be easier. If you found the previous lesson hard, then this lesson will present similar challenges, but it will be slightly easier, I think, because the concepts are slightly more intuitive. So concepts like time restrictions and things like that aren't things that you'd immediately think of when you think of commands, right? But they're things that the usulis have discussed, and likewise the philosophical arguments in the latter part of the lesson. So that stuff isn't coming up. We're going to be looking more at just usage, but it gets a bit into the nitty gritty a bit. So with that said, I'm not going to take up too much more time on your introduction. Let's get into the lesson. Okay, literal and metaphorical. So these are additional principles in regards to the literal and metaphorical. So in total, there are 6 discussions that we're going to be having. So just if you recall, in the previous lesson, when we talked about commands and prohibitions, there was 4 subtopics underneath the discussion of commands, right? And then there was 1 subtopic under the discussion of prohibitions. So there's 5 topics in that whole section. Now, today we're going to be, well, not today, but in these next couple of lessons, we're going to be discussing 6 sub-discussions. So if you remember, words according to their usage and how they're commonly used can be we had 4 types under there. We had literal, metaphorical, and then we had clear, and was it clear? Is that the word we used? Need to scroll up. Can't remember what translation I used. And then I think we had, so we had obvious, not clear, obvious, and elusive. So we said it can either be, so according to usage, literal, metaphorical, obvious, and elusive. Those are the 4 types. That was the second category of principles that we covered. Anyway, today we're going to be looking at literal and metaphorical. And we're going to be looking at them in quite a bit of detail. As I said, there's 6 sub-discussions under this topic. So, to begin, there's 6 rules, you could say, sub-principles within this. And it's all to do with if there's a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning, which one do you take? Or when can you abandon the literal meaning? Or, all of these kinds of things. Because now with metaphorical meaning, there's a lot of possibility. People use metaphors in various different ways. So we need to kind of give some foundation and some principles to that, give some framework to that. How do we deal with this? Because, language is a very interesting thing. People come up with all sorts of idioms, and they're sometimes quite unintuitive to people who don't necessarily know the language or are new to or unaware of the custom of that specific region. So, first of all, the first general principle in regards to literals and metaphoricals is, if it's possible to base the ruling on the literal meaning, then the metaphorical meaning is not considered. Right? So again, if the literal meaning, if it's possible to base the ruling, so you have a text and that text can either be taken literally or metaphorically, right? The text has a metaphorical meaning or a literal meaning. Now, if the ruling makes sense, if it makes sense to take the ruling from the literal meaning, then you don't go to the metaphorical, because the literal is the default. And because the metaphor, the word in Arabic is musta'ar, isti'ara, and literally means to borrow, right? So I know we have majaz, but you can also have something called isti'ara. And what that means is you're borrowing a meaning. So the word doesn't actually have that meaning linguistically. The dictionary doesn't give you that meaning when you look it up. But the person who mentioned that word has borrowed another meaning and added it to this word. This word is borrowing another meaning which it linguistically didn't have associated with it. Right? Now, if this metaphorical meaning is borrowed, musta'ar, right, the Arabic word, borrowed, then that can't compete with the default, right? If you borrow something, well, then you've just borrowed it, you're going to have to give it back. I'm just not with the meaning. Just think about something. Just think about like how we use how the concept of borrowing, right? If you have like a capital, or a principle or a default, something which is yours, versus something that you've borrowed. So this thing is in your possession because it's yours and you own it. That's the default, right? You own it. This thing is in your possession because you borrowed it. Now, this thing is not the default, this thing is. So now this borrowed thing can never compete with this default thing. So in the same way, a meaning, there's a word in the sentence, the default meaning is this, and now it's got this additional borrowed meaning, figurative, metaphorical meaning, right? Now this borrowed meaning can never compete with the default. So therefore, if you can go with that default meaning, you got to go with it, because the borrowed can never compete with the default. That's the first rule. That's the first rule of haqiqah. Now there's an example. It's very similar to a previous example we mentioned in this lesson. Remember, we talked about the expiation for breaking an oath. So I mentioned the whole verse there, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not take you to task for your redundant oaths, but He takes you to task for ما عقدتم الأيمان. So ولكن يؤاخذكم بما عقدتم الأيمان. Allah will take you to task for those oaths, and I said that you have made firm. That is a metaphorical meaning. The literal meaning is, so the word is عقدتم. عقدتم الأيمان. So عقدتم has a, you can kind of take out the word munaqida from there. ينعقد, right? Which means oaths for things which are to take place. And that's the literal meaning. Right, I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a second. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not take you to task for your redundant oaths, your yaminul lahu, right? And I'm not going to go into that because it's not a fiqh lesson, and the chapter of oaths is a weird and wonderful chapter with you know, a very interesting chapter, and something that you should definitely study, because it's something that, you know, most people, I feel, don't have common knowledge of. Anyway, there are three types of oaths. The first one, redundant oaths. Redundant oaths are oaths which, well, there's various understandings of redundant oaths. Let's not get into that. Effectively, it's an oath that you made about something in the past and you thought it was true, but it wasn't, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't take you to task for that. Then you've got Yaminul Ghamus, which is an oath taken on something in the past or present, and you take that oath knowing it's false, right? So you've intentionally lied about something in the past or present, so there's no way you could have made a mistake. You've intentionally lied about it, and you've taken an oath of Allah's name on that. That is a major sin, and right, that's another type of oath. Then the type of oath that we're discussing here is oaths made about things which are to occur in the future. So the example I gave previously, I swear I will go to your wedding. Somebody says, right? Somebody says, okay, you know, he swore an oath, I'll go to your wedding. By Allah, don't worry, right? I'll be there. That's an oath on something in the future, right? You've taken Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name and associated it with some action in the future. So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying in this verse is, لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not take you to task for your redundant oaths, which is the first category I mentioned. Oaths in the past, which you thought were true, but it turned out that, you know, maybe you were wrong. So you took an oath thinking it was true, but you made a genuine mistake. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He won't take you to task for those, right? So those are inshallah forgiven. However, He will take you to task for ma aqadtumul ayman. And I initially translated aqadtum as those oaths that you have made firm, right? And that's a metaphorical meaning. Because the literal meaning is the yameen ma aqadtum, those that you have, those yaminul munaqida that you've taken, those oaths that you've taken on something which is to occur. Now, why don't we take the meaning of firm? Because the meaning of firm also includes the other two categories within it. Because all oaths are something that you have made firm, right? So if you took the meaning as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will وَلَكِنْ يُؤَاخِذُكُم بِمَا عَقَدْتُمْ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take you to task for those oaths that you have made firm. Well, all oaths are made firm. So it's going to include laghu, the redundant oath, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already said He's not going to take you to task for. And it's also going to include the Yamin al-Ghamus, which again, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish you for as well, unless you do tawbah. So, but here we're specifically talking only about the oaths which will occur in the future, not the other two, because the other two don't have kafara associated to them. The other two you don't have to pay an expiation for. In one, you're just going to get a sin. In the immersing oath, Yaminul Ghamus, the immersing oath, the one where you lied about something intentionally, well, you're just going to get a sin for that. There's no expiation you can do to thingy that. You can just hope that you'll be forgiven by your tawbah if you do tawbah, right? And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive that. But there's no expiation there. And likewise, in the Yaminul Laghu, in the redundant oath, there's no expiation there either. So we're taking the meaning of Yaminul Munaqida, which is the literal meaning, in order to, because that's the literal meaning. And remember the principle. The principle was, if the literal meaning is possible, then you don't take the metaphorical. Right? So all of that long-winded explanation boils down to this one point. If the literal is possible, the metaphorical is not taken. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take you to account for your aqadtumul ayman, for the oaths that you have done aqadtum. Now that can either mean the oaths that are munaqida, the oaths that refer to something in the future, right? So you have to pay expiation only for those oaths that you have broken, the ones in the future, right? That's the literal meaning. Or the other possibility of that meaning is the metaphorical one, which is where you just take the meaning of made firm, and that refers to all the types of oaths. So all the types of oaths that are broken, you'll have to pay expiation for. However, we went with the literal meaning, and therefore you only have to pay expiation on the oaths that you have made about something in the future which you break, and not about, and you don't have to pay expiation for the redundant oath, and you don't have to pay expiation for the immersing oath, right? That's the ruling that we get to after that entire long-winded explanation. Right. So now that you know that we will always take the default literal meaning if it's possible, right? So if the ruling makes sense with the default, with the literal meaning, then that is the default, and we won't take metaphorical. Now, that is kind of the overarching principle upon which the entire discussions of literal and metaphorical apply. And all these other principles are effectively justifications for why we might go with the metaphorical meaning in certain cases. Because if the default is literal, then we'll never go with the metaphorical ever, right? So the remaining principles all talk about cases where we're going to abandon the literal and go with the metaphorical, and why. So the second principle talks about the types of literal meanings. So literal meanings can be of three types. And again, these are very intuitive, right? You don't really need this categorization. You probably just automatically understand them anyway. So a literal meaning can be of three types. The literal, a haqiqah, can be of three types, three categories. So the first one is haqiqah muta'azzira, which is a impossible literal. So what this is, the literal meaning is not possible to take it. Either it's impossible to take it, or you can take it, but it would be absurd, right? The literal meaning can't be taken except with some kind of difficulty and some kind of absurdity. So example of that is, if I say, if somebody swears an oath that they are not going to eat from this tree, or they're not going to eat from this pot. Now, nobody's going to eat the tree. Nobody's going to eat the branches. Nobody's going to eat the leaves, right? it's an absurd meaning. Likewise, it's impossible to eat that pot. Nobody is going to actually eat the actual pot. Nobody's going to take the pot and eat the pot, right? If you say, I'm not going to eat from this pot, well, literally speaking, the literal purport of those words, that the meaning that is the linguistic meaning that you understand is, you have this pot, you're going to eat from the pot, right? Eat the pot, right? From the pot, like take a piece out of the pot and eat it, or take a piece of that tree and eat it. Now, that is an example of an impossible literal. The literal meaning here is either absurd or impossible. Can't eat from the pot, and it's absurd to think that anybody's going to eat from that tree. So here, you're going to go with the metaphorical. As in, well, the metaphorical meaning is you're going to eat from, the leaves of that tree, or you're going to, etc. Or sorry, eat the fruits of that tree or something like that, or you're going to eat from the contents of the pot. That would be the metaphorical meaning associated with this example. So anyway, this is an example of an impossible or absurd literal. You then have an abandoned literal. So this is where somebody swears an oath that they are not going to step foot in the house of so and so. Right? Now, you're probably thinking, that's quite obvious, right? Why is that abandoned? So what this is where the literal meaning is not used. Nobody uses the literal meaning in this way, right? So it's possible for somebody to do this without difficulty. It's not absurd, but nobody uses this phrase in this way. The literal meaning has been abandoned. So if I say somebody swears an oath that they're not going to step foot in this house, in the house of so and so, what that actually means is stand outside, take one foot and put that foot inside the house while standing outside, right? He's not going to step his foot inside that house. Now, in Arabic, it's كَمَنْ حَلَفَ لَا يَضَعُ قَدَمَهُ فِي دَارِ فُلَانٍ. He's not going to place his foot in the house of so and so. And I've translated it as step foot because we kind of use it in a metaphorical way in English, similar to how the Arabic is used in a metaphorical way. And likewise, the literal also have similar meanings. But just bear in mind, it is a translation and it doesn't exactly match over always. So in Arabic, somebody who, if you swear an oath that you're not going to place your foot in the house of so-and-so, what that means is you stand outside that person's house and place your foot in their house while standing outside. Now, that's very possible to do. So the literal meaning is possible. Now, which based on our first principle would imply that if somebody made this oath, it means that they're not going to do this very specific action. However, this is an example of a abandoned literal. Nobody uses that phrase in Arabic to mean that. Just like nobody in English means that when they say step foot. I'm not going to step foot in this person's house, right? What does that mean? That if you climb in through the window, right, walking on your hands, right, that doesn't count? No, because step foot just means to enter. Likewise, in Arabic, that phrase, place your foot inside, just means to enter, right? That's the metaphorical figurative meaning. That's what everybody now assumes it to mean. So that is a abandoned literal. And then finally, you've got a commonly used literal, right? And that's every single sentence ever, right? So any word that's used in its literal form, commonly used literal. You've got billions of examples of that, right? Most sentences that anybody ever says are used in this way. So now I've just got a list here of some common figurative sayings in English. And I want you guys to think about whether these sentences are an impossible literal, an abandoned literal, or a utilized or commonly used literal. So, for example, his face is an open book. What would that be? His face is an open book. means you can read him really easily. You can understand exactly what emotions he's going through, what feelings he's experiencing. He's not hiding anything. His face is an open book, right? I'd say that is an impossible literal. Things have gone pear-shaped, right? The situation went pear-shaped. It depends really on what you're talking about. But I'd say that is, again, an impossible literal. If things go wrong, things go not the way you wanted it to, well, then they go pear-shaped. Or you could maybe, I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be an impossible literal. For example, if you said, I tried to fix your car, but it went pear-shaped. Well, I guess that's still an impossible literal because your car's not going to go pear-shaped, is it? That's a bit of an absurd literal. Okay. Then you've got, I'm going to hit the sack. What does means I'm going to go to sleep. I'm going to go to bed, but I'm going to hit the sack. I'd say that's an abandoned literal, not an impossible literal. It's an abandoned literal because you can hit a sack, but it's very possible to do. It's not impossible. It's not absurd, right? But nobody uses that in that form. It's an abandoned literal. Break the ice. Again, same thing. Let's you have them. You call them icebreakers. Break the ice to kind of clear the air or introduce people to each other, get rid of any awkwardness. So that is break the ice, right? Again, I'd say that is an abandoned literal because you can break ice, and it's a very possible thing to do. But in these contexts, you're not going to use it as in these ways. I feel like I'm talking to a brick wall here. And again, I'd say that is an abandoned literal. He's a million miles away. Impossible or abandoned? I'll leave you guys to, ponder over that one. So what's the rulings of each of these types? So the first two types, abandoned and impossible. So impossible and abandoned. If it's an impossible literal or an abandoned literal, you're going to go with the figurative metaphorical meaning. You're not going to stick to the literal, right? Because it's impossible or because it's abandoned. So we go through each of the examples. The tree that you're going to eat from. I'm not going to eat from this tree, or I'm not going to eat from this pot. Well, you're going to take the metaphorical meaning in both of those cases. You're going to say, I'm not going to eat from the fruits of this tree. That's what we understand from that. We're going to take that meaning. Or I'm not going to I'm not going to eat from the profits of this tree. So, if I'm going to cut this tree down and make it into something and make profit off of it, right? Well, then I'm not going to eat from or, benefit from the profits of that tree. We're going to take the metaphorical meaning. Now, that's if this tree doesn't have fruits. We go with the profit one. If it's not a fruit-bearing tree, because then the other figurative meaning is also impossible, right? So if I say I'm not going to eat from this tree, well, then that means I'm not going to eat from the fruits of this tree. But let's say it's not a tree that has fruit. Well, then Then you take another possible meaning, which is that I'm not going to take from the profits of this tree. Anyway, the pot. I'm not going to eat from this pot. We're going to take the metaphorical meaning, which is I'm not going to eat from what the pot contains, from the food within the pot. And likewise, so those were examples of the absurd or the impossible. The first one, the impossible literal. Now we're looking at the abandoned literal. The example was, I'm not going to step foot in this person's house. Well, what we're going to assume by that is I'm not going to enter this person's house. So regardless if you enter on a Segway, or if you enter flying, or if you enter it, handstands and doing walking on your hands, regardless, entry is what we're going to take because it's an abandoned literal. And then in the final case, in the case of the literal which is used, so there's a word which has a literal meaning, you can understand the literal meaning makes sense, but likewise it has a metaphorical meaning as well. Well, then what do? Well, if there's no commonly understood metaphorical meaning, then the literal meaning is the most superior without doubt, right? So if I say, let me take a picture of you on my phone, well, then that's an example of a phrase which you can't really take any metaphorical meaning. There's no commonly understood metaphorical meaning there. So we're just going to understand the literal meaning from it, right? And that's quite obvious. It's in the first principle as well. The literal meaning is the default. Now, if there is a metaphorical meaning, a commonly understood metaphorical meaning, right? Can't think of an example. Actually, there's an example coming. Yeah, if there's a commonly understood metaphorical meaning as well as a literal meaning which makes sense and is used, well then there's a difference of opinion here. And this is where I take an aside. If you know the Hanafi madhab, you have Imam Abu Hanifa who started off the madhab, then you had his two students, Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf. Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa, he's the main person at the top, and then his two students, Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. And they studied from him and they kind of developed his opinions after him and wrote books and spread his madhab, etc. And they're the main reasons why the madhab spread so much, because they were really good students. Anyway, in many places they differ from their teacher in some cases, right? And this is an example of one of those cases. So they differ from their teacher both in matters of jurisprudence, of fiqh, but they also differ in matters of in principles. So they sometimes they have slightly different methodologies in how they derive rulings, and we're just about to look at an example of that. Sorry, I forgot to mention this structure of the madhab in the introduction we did in the first lesson, so I just thought I'd bring it up now. So, if you have a metaphor which is commonly used, as well as the literal meaning which is commonly used and understood and makes sense, then how do you deal with that situation? You've got both possibilities. So according to Imam Abu Hanifa, he says that you take the literal. The literal is the default, we take the literal. Sahibain, Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, they say, no, we should actually take the what's called the umumul majaz, if there's an umumul majaz. And what that means is, if the metaphorical meaning is universal and includes the literal within it, then actually that universal metaphorical is better than the literal. That's the opinion of Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. I'm going to come to an example in a minute, but just before that, let me just reiterate what I just said. So this final category of literal, the literal which is used, the commonly used literal. First of all, if there is no commonly understood metaphorical meaning for that commonly used literal, well then we go with the literal, right? Because there's nothing competing against the literal. There's no metaphorical meaning that we even have to worry about. So we're just going to go with the literal, right? But if there is a metaphorical meaning which is commonly used, right? And remember, this is the third category of literal, so the literal is also commonly used. So the literal is commonly used and there's a metaphorical meaning that's also commonly used. Well then now we've got a bit of a decision to make. We've got to either take the literal or the metaphorical. So what do we do? So Imam Abu Hanifa says we take the literal. The literal is the default. We're always going to go with the literal. The literal is possible, even though there's a metaphorical that's also possible, and both of them make sense and both of them are used. The literal is always going to win out because the literal is the default, and the metaphorical is always going to be a sideman, basically. So that's what Imam Abu Hanifa says. And Sahibain, i.e. Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, we call them Sahibain because they're the two students. Sahibain, the two sahibs, the two companions of Imam Abu Hanifa, Sahibain. So Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, they both say, well actually, if the majaz, if the metaphorical meaning which is commonly used, so if that commonly used metaphorical meaning is universal and it includes the literal within it, then we take that one, right? And you're probably thinking, okay, that's a very specific case. And you're right. Let's look at an example. Somebody swears an oath that they're not going to eat from this wheat. So you've got, if you've ever seen wheat, if not, go Google it. But it's like it's like raw wheat, right? Like a wheat plant. So somebody swears an oath, I'm not going to eat from this wheat plant. Or they say, I'm not going to drink from this river. Or you could say from this tap. I'm not going to drink from this tap. Well, we can take the literal meaning, which is, I'm not going to drink from this tap directly. Like, put my mouth under the tap and drink from it. Or, for the bread case, I'm not going to eat this specific wheat. Like, I'm not going to chew on these strands of wheat. So that's the literal meaning. So that's what Imam Abu Hanifa would say. He would say that you're only going to be breaking your oath if you actually took that wheat and chewed on the actual wheat, or if you went and put your mouth under that tap, or you put your mouth in that river and drank directly. However, Sahibain say that actually you have a umum al-majaz, a universal metaphorical here, which is that if we take the metaphorical meaning of eating the bread that's eating anything that's come from this wheat, right? I'm not going to eat from this wheat. That includes the bread that is made from this wheat, the flour that's made from this wheat, and then therefore the resulting bread. But also I'm not going to chew the wheat directly. So it's a more universal meaning, right? The meaning includes multiple possibilities. It's universal. It's a category of things which includes both the literal meaning as well as metaphorical meanings. This is what's called a universal metaphorical, umumul majaz. Or in the water case, if you take the metaphorical meaning, the figurative understanding of I'm not going to drink from this tap as I'm not going to drink directly, or I'm not going to drink from it with a cup, I'm not going to drink from it, I'm not going to drink from this tap, i.e. I'm not going to drink any water coming from this tap, whether that's through directly drinking it from the source itself, or whether that's through taking a cup and drinking it, pouring into a jug and then a cup, or anything like that, right? So Sahibain say that actually, if we take the universal metaphorical, then that's better because it includes both the literal meaning and the metaphorical meaning. Anyway, that's another principle associated to literal. So let's recap the lesson. Okay, so we can now summarize our lesson on the literal and the metaphorical, or at least the principles that we covered in this lesson. Because we said there were 6 principles in total, and we managed to cover 3 of them right now. And so that means, inshallah, we'll cover the other couple of principles in the next lesson. So the first principle was, if the literal meaning is possible, then you don't take the metaphorical meaning. If it's possible to act and base your ruling upon the literal meaning of the sentence, or the word, or whatever it is, then you do not go with the metaphorical meaning, because the metaphorical meaning is secondary, it's subordinate, it's not the default, right? It's borrowed. Remember, the Arabic word musta'ar means borrowed. The metaphorical is a borrowed meaning. It's not the linguistically designated meaning, it's borrowed, right? And something that's borrowed can never compete with the default. So the default will always win if the default is possible, and the ruling can be based on it. So we gave the example of وَلَكِنْ يُؤَاخِذُكُمْ بِمَا عَقَّدْتُمُ الْأَيْمَانَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He will not take you to account for your redundant oaths, but He will take you to account for the oaths that you have. There's 2 meanings here. The literal is the oaths that you have made about the future, that's the literal meaning, or the oaths that you have made firm, that's the metaphorical meaning. And remember, we talked about 3 types of oaths. There's the redundant oath, which is the oath you made about something in the past, thinking it was true but it wasn't. right? So it was done in good faith. You weren't intending to lie. You just it happened, and so inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa taala won't take you to account for that. Then you've got the oath that you. So that's one type of oath, and then you've got the oath that you intentionally lied and on something in the past. That's called the immersing oath because it immerses you in the hellfire. So that's another type of oath. And then you've got the oath about something in the future that you like, it's a promise of something in the future that you took Allah's name to strengthen. So if you take the literal meaning, it's just talking about that third type. If you take the metaphorical meaning, strengthen, well then all oaths are strengthened, so it's referring to all three types. So then when the Quran carries on and tells you that the expiation is to free any slave, right? As we just did the previous example, well then that only applies, if you take the literal meaning, that only applies to the third category. If you take the metaphorical meaning, well then that expiation will apply to all three categories, right? So the jurists have taken the literal meaning here. Why? Because the literal meaning is possible. If the literal meaning is possible, you don't take the metaphorical meaning, right? So therefore, if you, for the other two types of oaths, the redundant oath and the immersing oath, you don't have to pay an expiation. The first one, inshallah, you're forgiven by default. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just will forgive you, right? And in the second one, you're going to get great sin for that because that's a source of great sin. You can't do an expiation for that unless, and your only hope is that you do tawbah and you repent and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives you. Moving on. That was the first principle of literals. The second principle of literals is that you have different types of literals, right? And so we talked about the different types of literals and what happens in each of them. So three different types of literals was the impossible literal. And the example there was, I'm not going to eat from this tree, right? Because eating from the tree is absurd. No one's going to do that and it's difficult to do. So you have to go out of your way and do difficult things to do this absurd literal, take this absurd literal meaning, right? Or I'm not going to eat from this pot, and that's impossible. You can't eat from the pot because the pot is impossible to eat, right? So that's a impossible literal. Then you had the abandoned literal, which was, I'm not going to place my foot in this person's house, right? And we said that that was an abandoned literal because nobody actually means that when they say that. Everybody just means something else. So that was an abandoned literal. And then we had the commonly used literal, and that's most sentences. So what's the ruling of each of these? So the ruling of the first two, the impossible and the abandoned literal, the impossible and the abandoned literal, the ruling of both of those is that we don't go with the literal meaning because it's impossible or abandoned, and we go with the figurative metaphorical meaning, and everybody agrees with that. Like all the scholars, you just do that, right? So in the eat from this tree example, we meant the fruits of the tree, or we meant if the tree doesn't have fruits, then we meant the profit that we make from this tree. And in regards to the pot example, I'm not going to eat from this pot. Well, then we meant what's contained in the pot. I'm not going to eat from what's contained in the pot. I'm not going to eat from the food within the pot, right? That's the meaning that we take. And then finally, for the abandoned literal, the example there was, I'm not going to place foot in this house, step foot in this house. Well, then we take the meaning of enter. I'm not going to enter this house. And then so that was the first two types and the ruling associated with them. The final ruling, the final type, which was the commonly used literal. So the literal meaning is used commonly and we can base a ruling on it. Well then, if there's no commonly associated metaphorical meaning with that literal, right? So if there's nothing competing with the literal, then we're just obviously going to go with the literal. If there is a metaphorical meaning competing with the literal, right? Well then, there is difference of opinion here. Imam Abu Hanifa says that we take the literal meaning still, because the literal meaning is the default. It's possible according to the first principle. We're always going to go with the literal. So therefore, if there's a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning, we're always going to go with the literal. That's Imam Abu Hanifa. Sahibain, i.e. Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, well, they say actually, if that metaphorical meaning is universal, it's a universal metaphorical. in that it includes the literal within it. So it's a metaphorical meaning which also has the literal meaning within it. Well, then we'll go with the metaphorical, that universal metaphorical, what's called the umum al-majaz. We'll go with that, right? And the example given was somebody who said that they're not going to eat this wheat, or they're not going to eat from this wheat, or they're not going to eat from this tap or this source of water, this river, whatever. So the literal meaning is I'm not going to chew on these specific sticks of wheat, and I'm not going to drink directly by putting my mouth on the tap or sticking my mouth in the river and drinking. The metaphorical meaning is I'm not going to drink from this river, however it is. However I drink from it, I'm not going to drink from it. I.e., I'm not going to get a cup and drink from it that way. I'm not going to pour it into a jug and then pour that into a glass and then drink from the glass. I'm not going to get my hands and scoop it up and drink it, and I'm not going to stick my mouth and drink it either. So the literal meaning is covered. Likewise with the wheat example, I'm not going to eat this wheat by chewing on it, but also I'm not going to eat from this wheat, however it is. I'm not going to eat from it either by chewing on it, I'm not going to eat from it by making it into bread and then eating that bread. I'm not going to eat it in any other way either, right? So that is the metaphorical. The metaphorical is universal and it includes the literal meaning within it. So Sahibain would say in all of these cases that we're going to take the universal meaning because it contains the metaphorical within it as well. So Imam Abu Hanifa would say, well, the literal meaning is possible. We take the literal, we ignore the metaphorical. And so that is our lesson and summary of the literal metaphorical. The first two principles of it. We're going to do the other four principles, inshallah, in the next lesson. Come with your thinking caps on because there are a few rather complicated, well, not rather complicated, but a few, a bit more difficult examples to explain.